Okay, now let's talk about how it is that the Supreme Court became so powerful. At one level, it's really a very, very simple story. And it's all bound up in a very, very famous case that came before the Supreme Court, which receives a lot of attention in your text, and for which you are deeply, deeply responsible. It is inconceivable that any student of American politics, first year or not, has not heard about the case Marbury versus Madison, Marberry v. Madison, Madison, 1803. Marbury versus Madison is so significant because that is the case that firmly established the role of the Supreme Court as a participant in the overall process of deciding who gets what, when, where, and how. It does this by the device of judicial review. Marbury versus Madison enhances power of the Supreme Court by establishing the power of judicial review, which you may recall way back when we talked about what makes American politics American. We said judicial review was something that is uniquely American. The Supreme Court can decide whether a law is not fair or unfair, just or unjust, but whether it is constitutional or unconstitutional. And that is a huge power indeed. I will try to take you through as quickly as I can the details of the case. The second president of the United States, John Adams, lost an election to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. In between the time of the loss of the election and the inauguration of President Jefferson, President Adams appointed a number of judges. Sometimes they're also called commissioners. They have a bunch of different titles. I think officially they were called commissioners. In effect, they were judges for the District of Columbia. Mr. Marbury was among those appointed. Not that it matters, but these guys that were appointed by President Adams are known as the midnight judges because they were appointed late at night, and it was an attempt to maintain Federalist control over the anti-Federalist Jefferson. Excuse me. When the Jefferson admission took office, they refused to deliver the commissions to the midnight judges. In other words, you have to formally be instituted in your job. And Mr. Marbury didn't like that. So he sued the Secretary of State, Mr. Madison, and said to the Supreme Court, I want you to force Mr. Madison to deliver to me my commission as a judge. The formal term is, Mr. Marbury said to the court, Mr. Supreme Court Justice, I would like you to issue a writ of mandamus, Mandamus. A writ means an order. Mandamus means of hand, deliver, to mandare, to mandate. So, Mr. Marbury asked the court to issue a writ of mandamus, which in plain English said, tell these guys they have to give me my commission. Okay. Now, why the Secretary of State? This is a side point. We think of the Secretary of State as the chief diplomat of our country, and with very good reason. Actually, it's the job of the Secretary of State to tend to all matters that affect all the states. So in a case like this, it would fall under the Secretary of State's purview to do this. Remember when President Nixon resigned? It was the Secretary of State, Mr. Kissinger, to whom he sent the message. Hence, that's, I hope, some kind of a sidebar that you might find to be of some interest. This put the Chief Justice, John Marshall, in a bind, because he knew that if he issued the writ of mandamus, he was going to aggravate the new president. If he failed to issue the writ of mandamus, then he would not be true to his generally Federalist sympathies. So, and this is not a cynical, and also he was torn both ways. Basically, what Justice Marshall did was try to have it both ways. He said, you know, actually, Mr. Marbury, you really ought to, you know, your appointment was legal. And you ought to get your commission. But there's another issue here. We operate under the Judiciary Act of 1789. Remember that? And the Judiciary Act of 1789 says that we have the power to issue, to force, or to issue a writ of mandamus in this case. But actually, we don't have that power. Therefore, that portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. Now, did I make that clear, I hope? Marshall sort of had it both ways. He said, yes, the appointment was legal. We're not contesting that. But we are contesting the issue that we have the power to issue that writ. Yes, it's in the Judiciary Act of 1789, but it shouldn't be in there because it expands, it assumes we have a power that we don't have, and we don't have that power to expand the base. Hence, we have the birth of judicial review and the obvious expansion of the power of the judicial branch. When we say that the Supreme Court is the court of last resort, that's kind of a dramatic way of saying they have the final say in everything. And they do. And the ultimate final say is whether or not a law, an act, whatever, is constitutional or not. So judicial review then involves interpreting the Constitution. Interpreting the Constitution. It also involves interpreting statutes. We interpret the Constitution. The Supreme Court can also look at individual laws passed by individual state legislatures or the Congress or the Senate and say, no, this particular aspect of the law is not constitutional. Now that's a very, very important power indeed. In effect, what it does is subject the Supreme Court to all the things that affect the sum total of politics in general. Remember we talked about political mood? Sometimes the country wants an activist government, as in the Roosevelt era. It had a non-activist court. What did President Roosevelt try to do? He tried to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. Didn't work, but more about that later. In effect, it made the Supreme, and I say this in the best possible way, it made the Supreme Court It politicized the Supreme Court. And as near as I can judge, the founders felt the Supreme Court should not be politicized. So that represents a major change. Furthermore, it introduced into our political discourse a whole new set of issues. Stated baldly, if you're a rampant conservative, why should a bunch of old men, and now women, but why should a bunch of unelected old men and old women be allowed to change the will of the Congress? It's a fair question. I mean, it is a fair question. And we cannot ask you, and I would ask you to think about that. Do you think judicial review is a good thing? I think that might very well be an essay assignment or a question on your exam. And why? What are the benefits of judicial review? And what are the shortcomings and what are the problems associated with judicial review? I hope I have in this little segment explained to you the source of the power of the Supreme Court. I hope I have explained to you why it is that the court is a player in the general process of deciding who gets what, when, where, and how. I hope I have explained to you the basis, the history, the reason, and the justification for all of this. And I know I have ducked the question of whether judicial review is good or bad. I'm going to say I think it's a good thing. But there are reasons to argue the other way. And I want to leave that out there as a big question mark so we can return to it, which we'll do sooner rather than later.